All right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is John Fassman. I'm the Washington correspondent for The Economist. I have to plug our paper before I start. We have supported drug legalization since 1988, back when it was considered a fringe, irresponsible position. I'm very glad to see that the world is catching up. Today's panel is about cannabis and tax fairness. And this fraught subject got a jolt of good news recently. Colorado's Republican Senator Cory Gardner said that President Trump promised to support congressional efforts to protect states that have legalized marijuana. And Chuck Schumer announced that he is proposing a bill to decriminalize cannabis at the federal level. That puts him at odds, of course, with Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who's one of America's last dedicated drug warriors. And among the things we'll talk about today is what this actually means for the industry. And I have a great panel to discuss this with me. We have Michelle Minton from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a libertarian think tank. We have John Kagia, who is Executive Vice President for Industry Analytics at New Frontier Data, which is a consultancy focused on the cannabis industry globally. We have John Hudak, a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and Deputy Director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution. We have Neil Levine, who is Chairman and Founder of the New Federalism Fund, which is a 501c4 focused on state-level cannabis laws. And we have Grover Norquist, who is President of Americans for Tax Reform. So Michelle, let's start with you. And let's start with a very basic question. Most Americans support legalization. Why is it not yet legal?
Well, and I've said this before, really what it comes down to is incentives. So if you ask someone in a poll, do you support drug legalization? 60%, over 60% will say yes when it comes to recreational. About 80% will say yes when it comes to medical. But of that 80 or 60%, very few of them are willing to go to their representative and say, I am not going to vote for you if you don't legalize marijuana or if you don't support marijuana legalization. However, there are a small minority of people, especially on the Republican side, who happen to have a lot of money, who will say, I will not fund you if you support marijuana legalization. So it's just easier for politicians to keep their head down. But by my numbers, there's at least 50 people in the House, 50 representatives in the House who have already voted for some kind of marijuana legalization bill. There's probably another 25 or so who have voted in a way that makes me think, should some kind of bill come up, they'd be highly likely to vote for it. And then there's an unknown number of people who are quietly pro-marijuana. In particular, on the Republican side, there are a lot of Republicans who say that they believe in states' rights or federalism, which is the more appropriate term. I know Grover will say states don't have rights, people have rights. So those type of people, for example, a Paul Ryan, who should support descheduling marijuana, taking it out of the Controlled Substances Act. Paul Ryan, of course, has been pretty anti-marijuana legalization. However, he started to soften a little bit. And I think should a Chuck Schumer bill, for example, come up, it's likely that he'll go along with the tide. In the last year even, we've seen so many bills that makes me think the pressure is starting to shift a little, the incentives are starting to shift, but it's still easier for a politician to keep his head down on an issue until it becomes an election problem.
So let me ask you to handicap those bills. If you were betting and the Cory Gardner bill, Chuck Schumer bill came to the House and Senate floor, would they pass?
I think that
I should ask, what are the chances they come to the floor? What are the chances they pass?
Schumer's bill, good chance. Gardner's bill, less of a chance. But it's because of Schumer's position, because he's in leadership. That leadership has, for the most part, taken a pretty anti-pro-marijuana position. Although you also have Mitch McConnell, who just introduced last week a hemp legalization bill. And Pelosi, I think, has said that she might eventually consider legalization of marijuana, and her voting has been pretty good. She's voted to make it legal for veterans. She voted for Rohrabacher-Farr, which would defund the Department of Justice from going after marijuana in the states where it's legal. So I think the Schumer bill actually really has a good chance, and Gardner's bill has gotten a lot of support. So I think it has slightly less of a chance just because of his rank, but I think they both have a good shot.
So marijuana is still illegal at the federal level. Are you surprised we haven't seen more federal marijuana prosecutions? I mean, I'm imagining an ambitious young DA in Denver, Seattle. He wants to impress Jeff Sessions. Why haven't we had someone going after a legal marijuana in states where it's legal?
I think because the repercussions are pretty high stakes for Jeff Sessions, for example. You know, up until last year, we had the Cole memo and we had Rohrabacher kind of handicapping them a little bit from going after legal marijuana offenses, if that's a phrase that I can use. But when they start going after, if that happens, what they do is they open the door for the courts to really start considering this. And it also puts more pressure on politicians to finally do something. If the states just start legalizing it and the federal government and the Department of Justice doesn't interfere, us voters, that 60 or 80% of people who say we want it to be legal, are fairly content. If the Department of Justice starts prosecuting mom and pop pot shops, it's hard to say, they start doing that, then people start to get angry, and it kind of moves up on their hierarchy of important issues when they go to vote.
So if we were to see a crackdown on the cannabis business, you think there would be, that would paradoxically sort of be a push toward full formal legalization?
Yes, and I think Jeff Sessions understands that, is that he's playing on the idea that what he really wants to do is not so much throw people in jail, although he definitely wants to throw people in jail, but he always wants to do that. But what he wants, and take their money also, what he really wants is to create a chilling effect in the states. He wants to stop the progress in the other states by threatening to prosecute. So state legislatures are often very hesitant to do anything when they don't know what the federal government's going to do about it. If they think, well, we're going to legalize and then all of a sudden we're going to have to deal with all these prosecutions, maybe we should just hang back and wait till we have clarification from the federal government. So I think that's what he's basically just trying to bully states into not moving forward with legalization efforts.
So when we spoke last week, you mentioned that there is a sports betting case pending before the Supreme Court that could have ramifications for the cannabis business. What's the case and what are the ramifications?
Right, so the case, originally it was called Christie versus the NCAA. Now it's Murphy, because Murphy is the governor of New Jersey. And the basis of the case is New Jersey wants to legalize sports gambling. There's a federal law that's been around since '92 that said if you didn't have sports betting then, you can't do it now, ever. And New Jersey says that's unconstitutional. Part of our Constitution says that the federal government cannot tell state legislatures what they can and cannot do. I mean, it can tell us individuals, it can say, for example, marijuana is illegal, and then states should not be able to legalize it exactly because of the supremacy clause. But that's not what this gambling law did. It specifically is addressed at the states, at the state legislatures. So this is one of the things that it wouldn't, should New Jersey win, should the Supreme Court say, yes, the federal government cannot tell states what to do, it would bolster the case for state legalization of marijuana. It wouldn't be a clincher, but it would definitely raise the profile of this idea of federalism.
So let me backtrack a bit. 280E, I think you should give the audience a sort of brief explanation. What does it do and why is it there?
280E, sorry.
The tax law, the law forbidding, the law that bars marijuana businesses from claiming tax deductions for normal business.
That's a question you're going to have to ask one of the tax experts.
Okay, all right. So tell me where the sports betting case lies now. It's before the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so they heard arguments in December. I was there. A surprising number of justices seemed very sympathetic to New Jersey and very aggressive towards the federal government, because the Solicitor General did give arguments in front of the Supreme Court and they didn't really seem to buy his argument. So we're just waiting now. Any day we could get a decision from the Supreme Court, any day up till June 25th.
Okay. So John, let's turn to you. We have a better picture of the sort of national legal and policy landscape. Tell us about cannabis consumption. What are the trend lines? What are the demand lines you're seeing?
So the three, broadly speaking, trends that are converging that have been catalytic to why we're seeing this momentum behind legal cannabis. One we've just talked about, which is support for legalization. Nationally, 64% of Americans now support adult use or recreational legalization. Between 80 and 90% support medical legalization, depending on whose polls you use. But broadly speaking, when Gallup and Pew both say this is one of the fastest evolving social issues that they're tracking, it's moving even more quickly than gay marriage did. So if you recall 5-6 years ago when it suddenly felt like gay marriage, which had been such a contentious and deeply divisive issue, suddenly became mainstream and normalized, we're seeing cannabis moving even more quickly than that. The second is that not only is support for legalization growing, but the number of cannabis users, particularly the number of regular cannabis consumers, is growing very quickly. So currently, at least based on the government's most recent national survey on drug use, 22.4 million Americans, 1 in 10 Americans consume cannabis regularly. And that's up by 7.5 million Americans since 2009. Those are extraordinary numbers. Basically, 1 in 10 people in this room, well, this is Washington, it's actually double that, are regular cannabis consumers. It's your neighbors, it's your coworkers, it's your friends. And once you've had that connectivity to somebody who's either medical or recreational cannabis consumer, it's much more difficult to demonize them, and it kind of normalizes it within our communities. And then third is, in the legal markets, cannabis businesses are selling an extraordinary large volume of cannabis. Last year, we estimate that national sales topped $8 billion. In 2018, we were forecasting that sales will reach $12 billion. By 2020, that goes up to $17 billion. By 2025, just in the states where it's currently legal, we're looking at a $25 billion market. And that doesn't include any new states being sold. That is just sales to medical patients and recreational consumers. It's a huge market, and it's a huge market that is not creating new cannabis consumers. It's just taking consumers out of the illicit market and moving them into the legal market. Interestingly, I just looked up this statistic last night. Since 2011, interceptions of cannabis at our borders have fallen from 2.5 million pounds to 800,000 pounds. As the legal markets have stood up domestically, Americans have stopped or have dramatically turned away from cannabis being imported. And so you're seeing this recognition that when cannabis is legal, most consumers, as long as the pricing is right, would prefer to get it from legal channels because you get better quality, you get more options, you get a great selection and portfolio of products, and it feels like a regular commercial activity. It feels like purchasing anything else like you would in the consumer economy. And to your point about what would happen if enforcement were if the feds were to aggressively enforce it, we actually suspect that if in the communities where people have access to legal cannabis, getting that taken away will elicit a much stronger reaction than not giving them access in the first place. Because once you've had a chance to not feel like a criminal when you're a cannabis consumer, and you have to, a very large proportion of Americans are consuming cannabis illegally. Once you accept the fact that by legalizing it, you take away that criminal element to it, most people are not going to want to go back to that black market, which is why the pushback, if there's an aggressive federal action, is going to be so strong.
So you mentioned that the number of cannabis consumers are growing, and it's your neighbors, your coworkers. Demographically, is it growing among whom is it growing fastest? Growing among sort of older suburban Americans?
Great question. So a couple of ways to think about it. Historically, men have consumed cannabis at about twice the rates as women, but you're seeing much faster growth in cannabis use amongst women than amongst men. Historically, you've generally seen much greater cannabis use amongst younger age groups. So the under 35s consume cannabis at almost twice the rates of those over 55. But you're seeing much greater rates of adoption amongst older populations. And one of the reasons for that is the new product forms of cannabis that are available. So as cannabis has been legalized, in the pre-legal markets, the majority of consumers are cannabis smokers. You smoke it, in joints or in pipes. Both legalization, you have investment in infrastructure to develop new product forms. The quality of edibles is the caliber of food groups or foods that you would expect to see in Whole Foods, but just happen to be cannabis infused. You have these vaporizer products that take away the combustion element. So for people who are concerned about smoking, you now have non-smokable forms of the product that address that. And so with increased R&D going to new product forms, the decriminalization within legal markets, you have communities, particularly older populations, who have historically been very reserved about cannabis use, now saying, all right, well, if I don't have to smoke it, I can take it in a pill, I can apply it as a lotion to treat my arthritis, being much more willing to entertain it, particularly as healthcare costs are skyrocketing and people are looking for alternatives.
You mentioned the enormous amount of legal cannabis that states that have legalized are selling it. Can you generalize about what states are doing with the tax revenue?
Absolutely. So you have states like Colorado, which Colorado spends the first $40 million of its tax revenue, just over $40 million, towards school construction. In total, it's spending about, over 60 million in education in general. And that's quite compelling given when you think about the number of protests that have been held in places like West Virginia because there's not enough money to pay teachers or give them pay raises. There's a lot of capital being invested in health and health-related programs, from drug abuse and treatment programs to general holistic health, improving the health of our communities. And then there's a number of states who are just allocating a lot of the cannabis revenues toward their general fund, toward the ways in the totality of their state budget, using it to fill in some of the gaps. And the numbers are significant. Since 2014, Colorado has made nearly $750 million in cannabis taxes. Last year, it made $250 million alone. So these are significant numbers for state budgets, but at a time that states are increasingly squeezed on their revenues.
So when you see these initiatives sort of go forward at the state level, is it sold as a tax benefit policy? Is it sold as a sort of liberty issue?
That's certainly been one of the important arguments, and the 40 million clause in Colorado is one of the important ways to get some buy-in into the bill. So tax revenues has certainly been one of the ways in which this has been, or legal cannabis has been sold. But we think social justice is also another critical part of it. The decriminalization and the recognition of the social inequity with which cannabis prohibition has been enforced. When you're nationally 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis uses when you're black, or even though cannabis consumption rates are almost identical between blacks and whites. Addressing some of that inequity have been really important aspects of this debate.
So, John, let's turn to you. This industry has grown despite significant tax burden. You talk a little bit about 280E, how it came to be, what it does, and also about the federal banking restrictions.
Sure. So 280E is a section of the Internal Revenue Code that, in its most basic terms, says that if you are engaging in activity that is illegal in the context of drugs, you are not entitled to the type of business deductions that you would traditionally be eligible for. And Grover can go into more detail about 280E for sure. But there's this sort of irony in American policy, that is, no matter what illegal activity you are engaging in, whether you are a legal cannabis business in Colorado, whether you are the mafia, whether you are running a child prostitution ring, you are supposed to pay your federal taxes. Now, it may be shocking that most child sex ring leaders don't pay their federal taxes, but if they were willing to go to the IRS with a bag of cash from a bunch of perverts, they would pay their taxes, but they would not get the types of deductions. For instance, if they wanted to build an addition onto the house that they are running a child sex ring out of, the federal government would say, no, you're not entitled to those deductions. Now, I don't think there's anyone, I hope there's no one in this room who's thinking those poor pedophiles, that's terrible tax policy. But for a legal cannabis business, it's a serious issue. Especially at the beginning, the inception of a business, when you have tremendous capital needs, you also have tremendous tax burdens, because what a business is usually sinking money into, thinking that they will get they'll have the ability to deduct that come tax time. Every other legal business in the United States has access to those benefits. Cannabis businesses don't. And so people who are out there who are fearful of big marijuana, it's a lot easier for a large marijuana firm to absorb those costs than it is for a mom and pop firm to absorb those costs. So Section 280E creates this dynamic where businesses are getting hurt constantly. Patients and customers are getting hurt constantly. Why? Because when you can't deduct those taxes, the price for that business increases. The business isn't paying that price. You're paying that price at the point of sale. And so it raises prices across the industry, not because of anything that the industry wants to do, but because of what the industry can't do. And that has effects on the ability to displace the black market. It has wide-reaching effects across the industry and across the country. To your question about banking restrictions. This all gets tied in. The first panel of the day was talking about how difficult it is to pay taxes when you're a cannabis business, at the state level and at the federal level too. State treasuries do not like you coming in with a big bag of cash or a pallet of cash for some companies in order to pay your taxes. In part, when a business does not have access to banking because of Treasury and Federal Reserve and other regulations, they have to become a cash-only business. The irony in all of this, and this is a real killer for me, is that this all exists because of fears about money laundering, because of anti-money laundering policies in the United States. There is no bigger facilitator of money laundering and tax cheating than the United States government because of the regulations that come out of FDIC, that come out of Treasury, that come out of a variety of places, including the Federal Reserve. If you are cash only, if you are forced to be cash only, it is much easier for you to skimp on your taxes. It is much easier for you to launder money. And while most of this industry is full of good actors who are well-intentioned, who want to be honest, genuine brokers and business owners, there are bad people in this industry too. And every day that cannabis businesses don't have access to banking is another day that those bad players in this industry are going to outwit and outsmart people in this industry and the government, and do a lot of terrible things with the money that they can stash.
So, please, how did this happen? Tell us how public policy on marijuana has evolved.
Public policy on marijuana has evolved in dramatic and interesting ways. And as a self-plug, if you'd like to read about it, you can buy my book, Marijuana: A Short History, available on Amazon. But it has been something that, I'm not going to go through the whole arc of history, but you go through this period in American history where the British Crown required landowners to grow hemp at times. Medical cannabis was something that was fairly common in apothecaries in the 1800s. And then suddenly, this may come as a shock, the federal government realized they could racialize this policy. First, to disenfranchise and turn white Americans against Mexican immigrants coming across the border. Boy, how times have changed, huh? And then suddenly marijuana, which sounded very exotic and very dangerous, was turned toward another community. Then it was a drug that the jazz movement used. And it wasn't by accident that the jazz movement tended to exist in New Orleans and Chicago and Harlem. And so this now became something the government could use to turn Americans against, white Americans against black Americans. And then it was beatniks in the 50s, and it was hippies in the 60s. And when Richard Nixon became president, it was Jews who were the big users of marijuana. He's on tape saying that. And so this became a product that was made illegal, first informally and then formally. Not because of harms, not because of science, not because of our understandings of public health, but because of politics and racism and the ability to divide and the ability to get votes. And so where we are at now is a position where states are saying no to this. Legislators at the federal level are saying no to this because they understand the history and they understand the substance, and they're looking out at that landscape and saying, alcohol kills a hell of a lot more people in this country than cannabis. Nicotine kills a hell of a lot more people than cannabis. We as states, we as individuals can probably make better choices about this drug than a crazy man named Harry Anslinger did at the Bureau of Narcotics in the 1930s.
He's worth a mention. Talk a little more about Anslinger and what he did.
Harry Anslinger cut his teeth at the Bureau of Prohibition, and then he was appointed to head the Bureau of Narcotics in the early 1930s. He was a peer of J. Edgar Hoover's. In fact, he ran the Bureau of Narcotics for almost the same amount of time as J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI. And he was a teetotaler. He was a vowed prohibitionist, and he found cannabis to be the product that he could sell, I guess you could say, he could sell to the American public as something that was a problem. And so you see him writing in newspapers, writing in academic journals, testifying before Congress about all of the terrible things that cannabis does. And this should seem familiar to any cannabis user out there because I think you've experienced these same problems. You've committed rapes and murders. You've gone psychotic. For the white women in the audience, you've done the terrible thing of having sex with a man of color if you used cannabis. These are things that this man literally said to Congress in newspapers. And it scared white America. It scared people about what it meant for the fabric of society. And he was a master psychological manipulator who helped turn this nation against a drug that had been part of society since before the founding.
Man, all right, thank you. Neil, we haven't had a business view. You're out there in the trenches. How does 280E affect you?
Not to disagree with John, who I respect greatly, but local taxes can be passed on, but 280E cannot. When you're paying an effective rate of 80% or more, there's just nothing coming out the tailpipe, any way you cut it. Mom and pops, there's no way for them to make anything if they're paying their taxes. Maybe if you run a really, really smart business and you're able to scale, you can pull single-digit percentages out of profit of the business, but not enough to properly scale, not enough to reinvest into your business. It is an industry killer. It's there on purpose. The federal government is using it to keep the industry small and poor. And going back to the history of how 280E began, was actually an industrious drug dealer out of Minneapolis by the name of Jeffrey Edmondson was arrested. He went for some standard business deductions for his cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana business. And he won in tax court. So the Congress responds in the early 80s by passing 280E, which says if you traffic in a Schedule I or Schedule II controlled substance, which marijuana, cocaine, and methamphetamine all are, you may not take any standard business deductions outside the true cost of goods sold. They never envisioned an industry like ours existing in the early 80s when they passed this law, and 280E has been misapplied and targeted to our industry since California passed Proposition 215. This has been historically a bipartisan issue. That was the Clinton administration. The head of the ONDCP back then was General Barry McCafferty, and that was originally their policy to use 280E and everything in the code they could to try and strangle the industry in the grave. And they've slowed us down, but they haven't strangled us in the grave, in the cradle, I mean.
What about regulations around financial services and banking? What would you like to be able to do that you can't do?
We'd like to use a bank.
Credit cards?
Can you use local banks? I mean, credit unions, state-based credit unions, things like that?
It's patchwork. And, going back to what you were talking about earlier in your introduction, I actually have some big news that I'd like to share with everybody here. So, we've been working closely with Senator Gardner through the New Federalism Fund, working mostly on tax policy and banking and such. And this was historic news that came out last Friday. It's huge progress, regardless of how this goes forward. John was correct in saying that, okay, now there's a ton of work to do to actually get legislation through the Senate, through the House, and get us into a position where we might actually be able to significantly change federal law. As an industry, the New Federalism Fund is now joining forces with the American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp, and we are going to form a new cannabis trade federation and bring significant resources to the lobbying fight to try and pass this legislation and normalize this industry once and for all.
Great. So let's pivot off that and tell us about the New Federalism Fund. What is it? What are its goals? When is it formed?
We're a 501c4, and basically coming out of the 2016 election, we formed because we saw a potential opportunity with comprehensive tax reform. We have a very bad tax issue, and so we thought as part of that package that it was a coin flip shot, and as an industry, we took a shot because that was the best shot we ever had to fix this horrible tax problem. We didn't get into comprehensive tax reform, but obviously from the news that we've all seen in the last week, we were able to make a tremendous amount of progress, and we are poised on the brink of real federal change, and it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of resources, and we're ready to go.
Tell us about the conversations that you have on the Hill, as the NFF has, with how do they differ depending on the political leanings of who you're talking to? How do you frame this issue?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not really a party issue. I think it's more of an age issue, to be honest with you. You'd be hard-pressed to find a Republican on the Hill under the age of 40 who's against us.
Right.
I think that when you take a look at this overall, this is actually a bipartisan issue that touches each side. It's a social justice issue. It is a federalism issue. It is across the board a massive confiscation of wealth and personal rights, And we are because of the state-federal conflict, because the federal government is executing policies that is not allowing the states to be the laboratories of democracy. We now have 9 states plus the District of Columbia that have opted out of prohibition entirely. We have 30 states plus the District of Columbia that has medical marijuana law, at least on the books. The toothpaste is out of the tube, and this is only going one way. The federal government should step back. They should allow the states to be the laboratories of democracy. The sky has not fallen. It's going well. We're generating tons of tax revenue. In states that have passed laws, opioid deaths are declining. And, the experiment is working, and it should continue, and the federal government should get out of the way.
So if they did that, if 280E were rescinded, what would the growth in the business look like? I mean, it
would be monumental. I mean, our EBITDA looks great, but basically, 280E is a massive confiscation of wealth from both the businesses and the states.
Yeah. I want to see if I can get you to say something indiscreet. Who are cannabis's best friends on the Hill?
Well, people know we've had a lot of people in the press just recently.
Other than people from...
I don't want to leave anybody out, so.
Other than people from states who have legalized it, who are the best friends? Where are the most productive conversations? What issues are the most productive conversations?
We've had tons of productive conversations across I'm not going to out anybody who hasn't outed themselves, so it's a nice try, but I'm not going to do it.
Thank you. I want to ask you the same thing that I asked Michelle. If the Gardner bill, or the Schumer bill came to the floor, you expect to see it passed?
We're going to work really hard to see it pass.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Grover, is this a federalism issue or a prohibition issue?
It's both, and I think it's important that people look at it because they're different audiences. There are people who oppose prohibition. They're already on your side. And there are others who haven't thought of it as a federalism issue, but it has been approached that way, meaning instead of sitting around and waiting until you had 218 House members and 60 senators, which is a long wait, and I think we wouldn't have gotten close to majorities in the House and the Senate if there hadn't been successes in the states. There's a fear of the unknown. Mm-hmm. One of the things that helps, I've worked on criminal justice reform issues, and the fact that Texas did it first and decided we're not putting as many people in prison for as long on all crimes. And then other states go, and nobody lost an election in Texas. That's pretty cool. And then they just did it in Georgia. And the one place it came up in a primary was one guy who was very conservative who had voted for criminal justice reform. He was attacked by someone who was more conservative because he was taking too much credit. Not because he voted wrong, but you weren't really that important in this So when people see that an issue is safe politically, and also safe, I mean, if people were piling up cars in Denver, people would go, whoa, wait, let's see what that is. But that's not happening. And so as a number of states do this, I think it becomes much easier, one, for other states to do it, but also for the federal government to say, we recognize that the concerns people had are not what we thought they might be. And your secret friends become not secret friends because I was always on your side on the subject.
Yes.
The challenge is, and this is where you get to 280E, which is the law that says if you're selling marijuana in a state where it's legal, the federal government, for federal taxes, says you can't take any ordinary business deductions, paying your staff, rent, buying marijuana. None of those things. So that the recent tax cut has helped the industry because it used to be a 35% excise tax, not a 35% tax on your profits, but a 35% tax of every dollar of sales, 35% excise tax, which is pretty rough.
Yes.
And then you have to add to that, you have to hire people and pay rent and things like this. Now it's only a 21% excise tax. And for pass-throughs, it's 37 down 20%. So it's a little less painful. But in point of fact, if you care about federalism, if you care about the idea that we have 50 states and they should compete with each other to provide the best government at the lowest cost, and then people, one, change their governments if they're not doing very good, or they change their governments by moving if they really had it with them. And millions of people move every year, and you can see where people move into and out of. So federalism allows states to decide what works, what doesn't. But the federal government, through 280E, interferes with federalism because they say, okay, Colorado, you've got this, but we have this massive punitive tax an excise tax rather than a profit tax, that makes it difficult. And when you talk to an audience about it who may not have an interest in or care one way or the other or even be hostile to marijuana, so how would you feel if school choice, a scholarship or a voucher, faced a 35% excise tax? Because while your state said we're going to have school choice, parental choice in education, the federal government, the teachers union said, no, we don't like that. We'll have this massive income tax on your scholarship. You would, in fact, cripple, damage the ability to have 50 states try things. I mean, you want 50 states to do different things, and some of them work and some of them don't. Nobody's life is a complete failure. Some states serve as bad examples. And on any given issue, you go, look at that, don't do that. Or over here, this is really working.
So have any states done marijuana wrong so far?
Well, there are a number of ways, there are lots of ways to do anything wrong. One of my least favorite is in Nevada, where they said, we want to be, marijuana wants to be regulated like liquor, wine, spirits, beer. That's what you don't want, okay? This is the one stupidest way to regulate anything in the whole world. We take it out of the Commerce Clause and tell states you can do any stupid thing you want and suggest how to maximize the number of people who extract monopoly rents out of the system.
So, sorry, unpack that a little bit for the audience.
Oh, when we ended prohibition the last time on spirits, liquor, beer, wine, we said, okay, states can decide how it's produced, marketed, and you have to have, so you're allowed to have 3 tiers. We have you have the store run it, and then the wholesaler, and these guys all manage liquor sales. And this is why you can't get a beer on Sunday afternoon. And they have all sorts of rules that you don't want to, that nobody else would put up with any other product. The guys in Nevada, the people who run the wholesale distributors, said, why don't we run marijuana just like we do spirits and run it through us? So we get to have a monopoly on the distribution. Well, unfortunately, they put a few $1,000s into the campaign, and they were able to write the rules. Remember, that passed. It's unfortunate. Ohio, you had 5 guys who had a bunch of land and said, we're going to legalize marijuana, but you have to buy it from our land. I mean, that was laughed out of court and didn't make it. But you have to watch out for people trying to write special interests into state constitutions as you're changing this. Washington State runs it a little too much like selling stuff out of the post office instead of allowing lots of different private sector competitors. So you can, but again, you look at that and say, don't do that, and move that way. So there's some very, I would stay away from treat us the way we treat spirits and wine and beer. That's a bad model. It's not a good, slightly better than prohibition, but it's not where you want to get stuck.
Let me ask you the converse question. Who does it well?
Oh, Colorado, I think, has been interesting. The guys who did it first did it, usually the third adapter sort of gets it right. The first 2 guys, oh, don't do that, don't do that. Now we know what we're doing. Very interesting. I think Colorado right now.
And Colorado does it right because why? Maximum amount of competition, least regulation?
Yeah, and now they promised there was only going to be 1 level of tax. I think they promised 15, then it went up to 25. Yep. That was unfortunate. And that's kind of a dirty trick because they said they weren't going to do that. But you always have to keep an eye on the governments because they always want to tax everything.
Right. We got a few minutes left, and we have a great panel. I'd like to open it to questions. Can I see? Yes, ma'am. I think, hang on, she's.
Oh, thanks. Hi. I'm wondering about what the tax implications are for third parties who is try to assist either dispensaries or cultivators, for example, if they want legal advice or if they want help with marketing. How are those businesses able to navigate the tax code? Would they be able to put money in banks and those kinds of things?
If you're not trafficking in cannabis, 280E doesn't apply.
Other questions? Sorry, it's incredibly. Yes, up there.
Yeah, Dave Bishop, I'm the Libertarian for Congress in Maryland District 4. Curious about.
Hang on, I think there's a mic coming to you.
Oh, that'll work a lot better. Thank you. I'm Dave Bishop. I'm the Libertarian running for Congress in Maryland's District 4. Curious about the implications of, say, we weren't able to get Schumer's bill through, for example. What are the repercussions, I guess not repercussions, but the results of simply just trying to get rid of 280E by itself if we weren't able to do more of what we want to do in other areas? For anybody.
I think we're going to get out of what Gardner negotiated with Trump, the two pieces, the way they're doing it, you'd end up with 280E sidetracked and the ability to bank restored because you take marijuana off the prohibited list. So the Corey Trump Concord and Cory Gardner of Colorado deserves a great deal of respect for. He put a hold on every single appointment nomination in the Justice Department, which got the attention of the #1 opponent of modernizing our approach towards marijuana, and took him out of the debate and went directly discussing things with Trump. And we have an agreement that should move forward that solves those two problems. Schumer's legislation goes further and solves some of the other challenges.
And one of the reasons why addressing this 280E issue is becoming more urgent is partly because of the industry dynamics. So if you look at Colorado as an example, and Colorado is a well-regulated market, the average wholesale price used by the state to set statewide taxation on cultivators, the average price per pound has fallen from about $2,000 a pound to $1,000 a pound in 3 years. It was one thing when your margins were very, very high, and when the market first launched, that you could take on, you could bear that 80% tax and still skim a little off the top, or take a little out of the business, get a little out of the exhaust pipe. But once you hit $1,000 a pound, there's a lot of folks who are getting squeezed out. It's much less tenable to survive under that environment at $1,000 a pound, when a lot of companies had set their break-even points at $1,000 a pound. So you add on top of the fact that you're hitting a break-even point and you're having this 70-80% federal tax. If this doesn't get addressed soon, you're going to see a lot of small and medium-sized operators in Washington, Colorado, and Oregon struggle to make it through the next couple of growing cycles.
Can I add to that quickly? I think one of the benefits of Chuck Schumer's bill, if you are a cannabis advocate, is not its chance of passage. It's not going to pass this Congress, period. Pete Sessions is not going to allow it out of the House Rules Committee. It is not going to pass this Congress. But here's what it does do. It signals to other Senate Democratic colleagues and to other House Democratic colleagues, I'm the strongest leader in this party right now. You have cover. This is an okay issue for you. And in discussing it, what did he say? He said, I looked at the numbers. I looked at the polling on this. This is a no-brainer. I'm paraphrasing. That's essentially what he did. And that's a real benefit moving forward. Chuck Schumer is not looking at his bill passing this Congress. He's looking to the next Congress, where maybe the House is controlled by Democrats. It will definitely be controlled by a different speaker in the next Congress. We know that. Perhaps there's a new Rules Committee chair, et cetera, and that can move the needle a bit. And that is part of this game. I think in terms of 280E, that is, in my conversations with legislators and their staff, and Brookings doesn't lobby, these are just conversations, that's an issue they get. Go talk to an old white man about, look up the medical research, or let me discuss with you how marijuana actually works. They don't know anything about this, but they do know about business, and they do know about taxes, and they understand the interaction of the two. So in my conversations, they get this more than a lot of the other issues in this space.
I want to bet John a dinner that we'll get it through this Congress.
Hey, I'll take your money any day. I'll take your dinner.
Yeah. Well,
Other questions? Yes, right there.
Hello, Andrew Santo, DC Dance Safe Harm Reduction Organization. I was wondering how much support the industry is getting from banks and lenders and regulatory institutions that can't necessarily support it legally yet. How much support are you expecting when federal finally changes?
I think you'll see a lot with chambers of commerce, for example, because they recognize these as what they are. They're small businesses. So once and a lot of, even you have lawyers who can't, in certain states, work with cannabis businesses because their professional organizations disallow them from providing advice to clients engaging in illicit activities. Once the federal law goes away, I think you'll start to see in certain areas, especially those professional organizations, a very quick turn towards supporting the organization. In the rest of the country, that will come a little bit slower as that, I think John mentioned earlier, as they see that potheads are not Cheech and Chong, they are, Nancy down the street or that coworker I work with who shows up at 9 a.m. every day and then leaves at 5.
I think we got time for one more. Yes, right there.
So real quick.
Hang on, let's get you a microphone.
Hi, how are you? With the states that have already recreationally passed cannabis and medically, how do we prevent monopolies from happening across the United States from those states that have already had that happen?
By not letting the government get in the way of entry. The only monopolies we have in this country are the ones that the government created for us. AT&T had to compete with a lot of other phone companies until they got a law passed that telephones were a natural monopoly. So natural that they didn't have one until they got the law. But then they were, it's a natural monopoly. Nobody's competing with us. Now there's a law against it. Post office does fairly well against all competitors on first-class mail, because there aren't any, because you go to jail, you try and do that. Not so well on parcels. Just get the government out of, you can't do this. I mean, the more they allow limits like occupational licensing, the hair braiders don't, you don't want the government telling people they can't go into a business or limiting it or putting these high barriers, the taxes being very high barriers to entry. Take those taxes down and get the regulatory barrier to entry down. And then you just don't end up with that problem because there's so much entry and exit from companies that come in and start and stop. Whenever you try and fix things by having so many rules, the guys who are already in decide to use those rules as a wall to keep other competitors out, and then you end up with monopolies or quasi-monopolies.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, and I think Grover really hit on it with the alcohol industry, and I'd been hearing from the distributors in the alcohol industry. I'd been hearing it for about 7 to 10 years. They were saying we need to get the 3-tiered system with marijuana because the beer business has been kind of declining in the large beer business anyway. Craft beer is really raising, and up until the last 10 years or so, you saw huge monopolies in beer. There was more beer being produced in this country than there had been since Prohibition, but it was mostly by 3 companies. And the reason is because each of the states just decided to go with the distributors and said, okay, so if you produce beer and you sell it at retail, you cannot talk to each other. You have to go through this third person, this distributor, that gave them an enormous amount of money because they controlled the entire industry. And it allowed them to make a lot of money and then pay politicians, give them donations, and then keep the laws the way they are and keep their competitors locked into certain areas. That's definitely what we don't want to see with marijuana happening. So hopefully Nevada will learn a lesson when they see all the surrounding states doing much better and then change their laws.
I've got the evil flashing red light there. Can you please join me in thanking this great panel?